Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a wolf in sheep's clothing who created his window of opportunity and he jumped through it. Now, I want to start off with inconsistencies in the defendant's case and what they testified to. Now, you heard testimony by a Mr. Casey Fish that the defendant was a well-liked guy in the neighborhood. You heard testimony from other neighbors. Even Mr. Salmon said that the defendant was a liked guy in the neighborhood because Mr. Grouper, the defendant, was creating this window of opportunity. And with each interaction that went well in his neighborhood, that window got bigger and bigger. You heard testimony that the defendant had a dog. And this testimony, you heard that Sarah liked this dog. You also heard, or may not have heard from Casey Fish, that he would shoo Sarah away. But who you didn't hear that from is the defendant. The defendant didn't testify to that. We also have inconsistencies in Casey Fish's story. You've got him saying that Mr. Paul Salmon beats Sarah. But when asked about it, he didn't see any bruising or prior abuse. He just heard about the prior abuse. You also heard testimony from Detective Tarpon that when they found the body, there was no evidence of prior abuse on the body before murder. Now, that brings me back to the night of. The defendant claims that when Sarah came to his house around midnight, she was beaten and bloody severely. Now, one would think that if an individual was beaten so severely as the defendant describes, there would be blood in her bedroom. You heard testimony that there was no blood found. You would more likely find a blood trail leading from her house to the defendant's house. There is no testimony to a blood trail. There's no testimony, there's no blood on her window seal. And finally getting to when she knocked on the door. When she knocked on the door, you heard this testimony that she was beaten and bloody severely. You heard testimony and evidence proved that the defendant, knowing that he was a registered sex offender, allowed her to come in, knowing that he was not allowed to be alone with anybody under the age of 18, allowed her to come in. His excuse was his friend was there, a Mr. David Mack, ladies and gentlemen. Old Mr. Mack. When we asked the defendant if he could provide any information about Mr. Mack, he absolutely refused. He didn't give a number. He didn't give anything. You heard testimony today, and the evidence proved that the police department couldn't find Mr. Mackerel. There's very little evidence that he even exists. He even gave testimony that Mr. Mackerel took his motor home and parked it at the 7-Eleven. But you've also heard testimony that the 7-Eleven clerk puts the defendant near the crime scene. What's really baffling about all this is that you would think that if you're a registered sex offender and you're being brought up on a crime that you allegedly did not commit, you would give them the information leading to the individual who actually did commit it. But again, we don't have that here. So that's their inconsistencies. There's a lot of them there. So now I want to bring you to what we do have. We've got a man, as I stated earlier, that has created his persona in the neighborhood as a nice guy. Everybody likes him. He fit right in. Well, that's what a wolf in sheep's clothing does. He fits right in. So when he sees his target, his window of opportunity, he seizes it. And that's what he did the night of Sarah's disappearance. What we do have is we have blood in his home. We've got an individual we can't find. And we've got a man on his second offense. He's already got a sexual molestation offense. And now he's being charged with kidnapping and murder and won't give the individual away. What we also have is blood in his motorhome that was found and his fingerprints in the motorhome. We don't have any other fingerprints of anybody else in there. We've got tire tracks from the scene where Sarah's body was found, linking it to an exact match of the defendant's motorhome. And we also have the 7-Eleven clerk placing, through a photo lineup, Mr. Grouper, the defendant, at the 7-Eleven at 3 o'clock in the morning, just a mile away from where Sarah's body was found. The detective also found that there was no prior injuries, no prior abuse on her body when they found it. Gagged and bound. This is how they found her. They found her gagged and bound. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to walk you through the law at this point, what we have to prove. We have to prove that the defendant forcibly, secretly, or by threat confined, abducted, or imprisoned Sarah Salmon. Now there's evidence that goes either way that says Sarah, by her own will, went into the house. Well, clearly, she didn't want to stay there. There's no evidence speaking to what she said after she went into that house and was brought to the basement of that house. And the only place that we have blood, again, ladies and gentlemen, is his basement and his home and his motorhome. And I'm going to remind you that her body was found bound and gagged. The second part of this is that Mr. Grouper acted with intent to commit or facilitate the commission of a felony murder. Sarah's dead, ladies and gentlemen. This young girl, 14 years old, she's dead. We've got the defendant and a bound and gagged body. All kinds of evidence linking this defendant to her body and to her whereabouts. Now, murder. I've already went through that part, that she's dead. I don't want to have to relive that, and I don't think any of you do either. But this death it occurred during the commission of his kidnapping, ladies and gentlemen. And in order to convict him of first-degree felony murder, it is not necessary for us to prove that it was premeditated. It's only necessary that he had the window of opportunity, because he's a wolf in sheep's clothing. And that's exactly what they do. They lay in wait for that precise moment. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we ask that you find that the defendant, Richard Grouper, is guilty of kidnapping and felony murder in the first degree. Thank you.